Revelation 16, verses 12 through 16, describes three evil spirits like frogs. Now, what are evil spirits in the Bible? They are fallen what? Fallen angels. That's important. And what do these three evil spirits do? They gather the kings of the earth and of the whole world for the final battle against the government of God. These three fallen angels, because they're evil spirits, they're angels, are actually the counterpart of the three angels' messages of Revelation 14. That is to say, the three angels gather people from every nation, kindred, tongue, and people on the Lord's side. And three counterfeit angels gather people from every nation, kindred, tongue, and people on Satan's side. So you have three genuine angels and you have three counterfeit angels, each with the intention of gathering people on their side. Now let's continue. The three evil spirits use a trilogy of earthly powers to accomplish their purpose. So you have the three counterfeit angels, but they have earthly powers that they work through. What is the name of those three earthly powers? The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, or the beast that rose from the earth. So we need to understand that the trilogy that Satan uses, the visible powers that Satan uses to gather as many as he can on his side, are the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Now we know that the dragon represents Satan, yes, but it's Satan working through the civil powers of the world. Satan, during the church of Smyrna, we are told, cast many of God's people into prison. Well, the devil didn't do it personally. He did it through Diocletian. The Bible tells us that the dragon stood next to the woman to devour the child as soon as the child was born. Well, the devil didn't stand next to Mary to devour Christ. He used a ruler of the Roman Empire. So we need to understand that the dragon, yes, represents Satan, but it's Satan working through the civil powers, through the political powers of the world. And then we have the beast. What does the beast represent? This is the beast from the sea, the first beast of Revelation 13. What earthly power does that represent? It represents the Roman Catholic papacy. And then the third member of the trilogy is the false prophet, or the beast that rises from the earth. And what does the false prophet represent? It represents apostate Protestantism. So in other words, the three counterfeit angels are going to use these three visible earthly powers to gather everybody they can on the devil's side. God's three angels are going to gather as many as possible on God's side. Now let's continue. Revelation 17 further amplifies this triple alliance. In other words, Revelation chapter 17 amplifies or expands what we find in Revelation 16. But in Revelation 17, these three powers are called by a different name. They are called the kings of the earth, the harlot, and the daughters of the harlot. So in other words, in Revelation 17, the dragon is equal to the kings, the harlot is equal to the beast, and the daughters are equal to the false prophet, or the beast that rises from the earth. Are you following me so far? The symbolic waters of the Euphrates, upon which the woman sits, the woman's name is Babylon. The river that ancient Babylon sat upon was which river? The river Euphrates. So the river upon which the harlot sits, the papacy, who has daughters, who fornicates with the kings of the earth, represents what? Multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. In other words, as long as the waters of the Euphrates, so to speak, the river of Babylon, are flowing, the harlot has her heyday, and the daughters and the kings. But the sixth plague says that the waters of the Euphrates, the symbolic Euphrates, are going to what? They are going to dry up. And they're going to finish off the harlot and the religious powers. Are you clear so far? Now let's go to the next section, because we are dealing with Revelation chapter 18. And we're going to take a look at when Revelation 18 verses 6 through 24 occurs or takes place. And for this we are going to examine the spirit of prophecy. In the Great Controversy, the book The Great Controversy, there are 3 chapters where Ellen White begins the chapter with a biblical passage. In other words, she begins the chapter by quoting Bible verses. Actually, the third time she doesn't quote the verses at the beginning of the chapter, at the first paragraph of the chapter, but she quotes it a little bit later on. Now notice the sequence of pages. On page 603, at the beginning of the chapter on the final warning, Ellen White cites Revelation 18 verses 1, 2, and 4. This chapter contains her commentary on the loud cry of Revelation 18, 1 to 5. Is that point clear? She quotes the verses from Revelation chapter 18, and she quotes verse 1, verse 2, and verse 4. So we know that the final warning is the loud cry. Then on page 613, which is the very next chapter in Great Controversy, the title of the chapter is The Time of Trouble. And Ellen White begins that chapter by quoting Daniel 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael shall stand up. And the standing up of Michael means the close of probation. And you know that because the expression stand up is used earlier in the chapter, in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, where, for example, it says 3 kings will yet stand up in Persia. That means 3 kings will still rule in Persia. So the standing up of Michael is when Jesus begins to rule his kingdom. But he can only rule his kingdom when his kingdom is made up. You see, the investigative judgment shows who is a member of his kingdom. And when every one of his children has been sealed, his kingdom is made up, and he stands up and probation closes. So she begins on page 613, the chapter on the time of trouble, by quoting Daniel 12, verse 1. She describes the close of probation, and then she describes the time of trouble after probation's close. On the next page, when you get to page 635 and 636, the title of the chapter is God's People Delivered. Now, although Ellen White does not begin the chapter with a biblical quotation, a careful examination of the first 2 pages of this chapter indicate that she is interpreting the 5th, 6th, and 7th plagues of Revelation, which occur at the very end of the time of trouble. So you'll notice that she has a sequence. The waters of the Euphrates are swirling, the harlot is having her heyday. Final warning is given, the 3 angels' message, gathering people on God's side. The 3 counterfeit angels are out there using this threefold power to gather people on the devil's side. Final warning is given, then probation closes. The time of trouble comes. And on pages 635 and 636, Ellen White describes plague number 5, 6, and 7 at the very end of the time of trouble. And then, the next chapter, on page 653 of Great Controversy, the very next chapter, is titled The Desolation of the Earth. And Ellen White begins this chapter by quoting Revelation 18, 5 through 10, verse 11, then verse 3, and verses 15 to 17. So the reason why I've gone through this is because I want us to see that Revelation 18, verses 6 through 24, is actually describing what happens during the last three plagues, particularly the seventh plague of Revelation chapter 16. In other words, it's talking about the final and definite fall of Babylon, particularly the financial system of Babylon. Are you clear so far? Yes? Is there anybody out there? I know it's been a long day, but I need to make sure that you're understanding the sequence. Let me review again. My wife says I review too much. But I always say to her, how do you think parrots learn to talk? Through repetition. So you have this sequence of chapters. Final warning, that's the loud cry. She quotes Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, basically. Then you have the standing up of Michael. She quotes Daniel 12, verse 1, time of trouble. Then the very next chapter, God's people delivered. She actually quotes Revelation 16, 17, and she's describing the last three plagues at the end of the time of trouble. And then in the next chapter, the desolation of the earth, she describes further what happens at the time when the seventh plague particularly falls. Now let's go to our next section, the sequence of events in Great Controversy 635 and 636. Remember, this chapter is titled, God's People Delivered. Now, in Great Controversy 635, Ellen White describes the first four plagues. Actually, it's page 627 to 629. You have it in parentheses there. And then on page 635, Ellen White has this quote. And you find it there in your syllabus. So in 627 to 629, she describes the first four plagues. She does it in less than a page. She goes quickly through these. During this period, God's people are in danger of being wiped out from the earth. And she describes on page 635 what's going to happen with God's people. They're going to be in jeopardy. It's a very short statement. She wrote, with shouts of triumph, jeering, and imprecation, throngs, what would be a synonym of throngs? Multitudes. What does the harlot sit upon? Multitudes. Throngs of evil men are about to rush. What is it that rushes? Waters. See, this is the rushing of the Euphrates, which is a symbolic river. Multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. They're about to rush upon their prey. In other words, the waters of the Euphrates, the harlot is sitting on the multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples, and these multitudes, this symbolic river is about to rush upon God's people to destroy them. And then on page 635, we find the drying up of the river Euphrates. It means that the multitudes are going to take away their support from the harlot. Notice the language that is used. The angry multitudes, so now we know the throngs are what? Multitudes. The angry multitudes are suddenly arrested. What would that be? It would be the drying up of the what? The drying up of the waters. Their mocking cries die away. The objects of their murderous rage are forgotten. Who are the objects of their murderous rage? The remnant. So what happens with the river that the harlot is sitting on, that this harlot Babylon is sitting upon? The waters are flowing, everything's going well, but suddenly the multitudes dry up on her. The multitudes are arrested. The waters dry up, in other words. And then on page 636, Ellen White actually quotes verses that describe the seventh plague. So the chapter, if you notice chapter on page 635 that has the title, God's People Delivered, Ellen White says that when the wicked are about to avalanche themselves upon God's people, darkness deeper than the deepness of the midnight fall upon the earth. The fifth plague is the plague of darkness. Then she says the multitudes are arrested. That's the drying up of the Euphrates, plague number 6. And then she actually quotes the verses that have to do with the seventh plague. Notice Great Controversy 6:36. In the midst of the angry heavens is one clear space of indescribable glory, whence comes the voice of God like the sound of many waters, saying, "It is done." Revelation 16:17, which is a verse that deals with the seventh plague. And she says that voice shakes the heavens and the earth. So in Great Controversy 635 and 636, Ellen White is actually describing the fifth, sixth, and seventh plague. And then throughout the rest of the chapter, she describes the events that take place at the period of the seventh plague. Now, the very next chapter in Great Controversy, after God's people delivered, is titled The Desolation of the Earth. And that begins on page 653. Ellen White here, in this chapter, picks up where she left off in Great Controversy, page 635 and 636. This means that she is now going to amplify the events that occur when God delivers his people, when he pours out the seventh plague. Do you remember that we read the seventh plague as God utters his voice and it said, it is done? In other words, the persecution against God's people is done. The very next chapter, notice how Ellen White begins the chapter. When the voice of God turns the captivity of his people. There is a terrible awakening of those who have lost all in the great conflict of life. So she's picking up in the chapter, The Desolation of the Earth, where she left off at the end of the previous chapter. Now she's going to amplify what will take place during the period of the seventh plague, primarily. We're on page 13, the top of the page. This quotation on the second page of the chapter, The Desolation of the Earth, takes us back to the moment when the voice of God delivered his people at the time of the seventh plague. This provides us with, and here's the important point because we're dealing with Revelation 18. This provides us with the precise chronological point for the fulfillment of Revelation 18, verses 6 to 24. Revelation 18, 6 to 24 is a description of the seventh plague, in other words. It is a vivid description of how the wicked will wail and lament when they forsake Babylon and Babylon falls. Here's Ellen White's description of what's going to take place during that period of the seventh plague. This is Great Controversy, page 655 and 56. The people see that they have been deluded. What would the people be? The waters, right? The people see that they have been deluded. Are they going to be arrested in their attempt to kill God's people when they're arrested? You better believe it. They accuse one another of having led them to destruction. But all unite in heaping their bitterest condemnation upon whom? The ministers. Were the ministers the leaders of Babylon? Of the beast and of the false prophet? Yes. So are the people going to wake up now and withdraw their support? Are the waters going to dry up on the harlot and her daughters? Absolutely. She continues writing, they accuse one another of having led them to destruction, but all unite in heaping their bitterest condemnation upon the ministers. Unfaithful pastors have prophesied smooth things. You know, Jay spoke a lot about this in the previous presentation. They have led their hearers to make void the law of God and to persecute those who would keep it holy. Now in their despair, these teachers confess before the world their work of deception. The multitudes are filled with fury. What are the multitudes symbolically? What are the multitudes? the waters. The multitudes are filled with fury. They're going to dry up on this system now. We are lost, they cry. So they're lamenting and they're wailing. And you are the cause of our ruin. And they turn upon the false shepherds. Were they supporting the false shepherds before? Were the waters of the river flowing, and the harlot was having her heyday, and the daughters, they were having a great time, and the kings were having a great time with harlot, as long as the waters were flowing? Yes, but the multitudes are going to be arrested. And now they're going to dry up on the harlot and on the daughters. She continues, the very ones that once admired them most will pronounce the most dreadful curses upon them. It's a serious thing to be a pastor. Very serious. Very serious what a pastor teaches. Woe to pastors if they don't teach present truth. Ellen White says that their punishment will be 10 times greater than of a common church member. It's a serious thing. The very ones that once admired them most will pronounce the most dreadful curses upon them. The very hands that once crowned them with laurels will be raised for their destruction. The swords that were to slay God's people, remember Great Controversy 6:35 and 36? They're ready to avalanche themselves upon God's people. The swords that were to slay God's people are now employed to destroy their enemies. Everywhere there's strife and bloodshed. And then in this chapter, Ellen White goes on to describe the financial fall of Babylon. Notice what she wrote in Great Controversy, page 654. If you read Revelation 18, the entire chapter deals with the meltdown of Babylonians' financial system. Everything in chapter 18 has to do with finances. Notice Ellen White's comment here. Remember, she started the chapter by quoting verses from Revelation 18, verses 6 to 24. So this entire chapter is describing the meltdown of the Babylonian financial system. Notice what she writes. The rich, those would be the merchants of Revelation 18, prided themselves upon their superiority to those who were less favored. But they had obtained their riches by violation of the law of God. They had neglected to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to deal justly, and to love mercy. They had sought to exalt themselves and to obtain the homage of their fellow creatures. Now they are stripped of all that made them great and are left destitute and defenseless. They look with terror upon the destruction of the idols that they preferred before their Maker. They have sold their souls for earthly riches and enjoyments and have not sought to become rich toward God. The result is their lives are a failure. Their pleasures are now turned to gall, their treasures to corruption. The gain of a lifetime is swept away in a moment. The rich bemoan. In Revelation chapter 18, you have the people, they're moaning and lamenting and groaning because they've lost everything. She says the gain of a lifetime is swept away in a moment. The rich bemoan the destruction of their grand houses, the scattering of their gold and silver. But their lamentations, here once again, referring to Revelation 18, their lamentations are silenced by the fear that they themselves are to perish with their idols. All this is going to happen at the period of the seventh plague, according to the chronology that Ellen White provides in Great Controversy, which follows the biblical structure as well. We're at the bottom of page 13. Thus, the central theme of Revelation 18, verses 6 to the end of the chapter, is the collapse of the world political and economic system that supported the Babylonian harlot and her daughters. At that point, the kings, the merchants, and the multitudes will see that they are lost and that their riches are worthless. Moreover, they are infuriated primarily at the wicked religious leaders who have deceived them with a prosperity gospel The literary style of the entire chapter, chapter 18, is that of a lamentation or a funeral dirge. When the Babylonian system collapses, the multitudes will realize that their religious leaders have deceived them, and they will turn on them. The religious leaders encourage them to get rich and to persecute those who keep the Sabbath. And then we have two passages from Scripture that describe this very moment. Ezekiel chapter 7, verses 15 through 19. They will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be like refuse. Their silver and their gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They will not satisfy their souls, nor fill their stomachs, because it became their stumbling block of iniquity. As for the beauty of his ornaments, he set it in majesty, but they made from it the images of their abominations, their detestable things. Therefore I have made it like refuse to them. I will give it as plunder into the hands of strangers, and to the wicked of the earth as spoil, and they shall defile it. Silver and gold will be worthless at that time, because people will realize that none of these things will be able to save them in this great day. And I believe that this has something to say to us as well today. I don't know whether you've been keeping an eye on what's happening with the stock market. Something very similar to what happened in 2008. Drastic movements, up and then down the next day, and up the next day, down the next day. Tremendous turbulence. I've been reading articles on what is happening. There's fear that there's going to be another recession, which is going to make the 2008 recession look like child's play. You know, how can we make sure that our resources are not devalued in the stock market or wherever? The way that we can do it is by investing in God's kingdom. You know, tomorrow I'm going to read a statement tomorrow afternoon where Ellen White says that, you know, many will come to the time of trouble, and they're going to try and sell the extra things that they didn't need. They're going to try and sell them. They're not going to be able to, because people are not going to be able to buy or sell. And she says that they're actually going to lament. They're going to say, why did I not use these resources for the growth of God's kingdom when they could be used? So it has something to say to us as well. The other passage is in James chapter 5, and Ellen White actually quotes this passage in this chapter of great controversy, the desolation of the earth. And I'm reading from the New King James Version. Come now, you rich, weep and howl. Is that what the people do in Revelation 18? Absolutely. For your miseries that are coming upon you, your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on earth in pleasure and luxury. Clear description of Revelation 18. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned. You have murdered the just. He did not resist you. We're on page 14, and then notice Great Controversy 641. On this page, Ellen White quotes Revelation 19, verse 11, verse 14, and verse 16, where Jesus comes on a white horse and he's followed by the armies of heaven to retrieve his people to take them to heaven. So what do we find in Great Controversy? We find the entire sequence of end-time events from the time of the final warning to the second coming of Jesus Christ. You have, once again, repeating what we've studied before, you have the final warning, chapter of the final warning, that's a loud cry. The next chapter you have Daniel 12 verse 1. Michael stands up, time of trouble. The next chapter, which is the deliverance of God's people, there you have Ellen White referring to the seventh plague. The very next chapter, the desolation of the earth, Ellen White describes, by using Revelation chapter 18, what is going to happen with those who accumulated riches. Ellen White shows us where Revelation 18 fits in the sequence of Scripture. That is during the period of the seventh plague, immediately before the second coming, because the next event that Ellen White mentions in Great Controversy is Jesus coming on a white horse with the armies of heaven. Now let's go to, on page of our syllabus, page 14 of our syllabus, at the bottom of the page. So let's look at a composite picture of Revelation 16 through 19. The spirits of devils at the end of time have totally possessed Babylon. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. Toward the close of probationary time, Babylon is totally demon-possessed, and have gathered the kings of the earth and the whole world to war against Christ in the person of his witnesses. The next point, at the close of probation, the waters of the spiritual Euphrates are at flood stage. With each of the first four plagues, the anger of the waters increases. So during the first four plagues, God's people are in jeopardy of being wiped out, because each plague makes Babylon more and more angry. However, we're going to notice that at the moment of the fifth plague, the situation of God's people turns. Let's go to the next page. When it appears that the waters will drown God's people, that is, the multitudes that have been gathered by the three counterfeit angels, the plague of darkness, that's the fifth plague, falls upon the earth, and immediately followed by the drying up of the flooding waters of the Euphrates in the sixth plague. That's when the wicked multitudes withdraw their support from the harlot. And then you have the seventh plague, which divides Babylon into three parts. The three parts were united before. Now they fight against each other. And then, of course, at the seventh plague, you have the scene of Revelation chapter 18, the meltdown of the financial system, turning against the counterfeit religious powers, and then the destruction of the wicked. Now, Revelation chapter 17 is an amplification of what we find in Revelation 16. Once again, the Babylonian harlot, which represents the papacy, seems to be in full control at the beginning of Revelation 17. She's sitting on many waters, that is, on the multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. She is actually ruling over them. She is fornicating with the kings of the earth. They're having a great time. It's a spiritual fornication. And she has the support of her daughters, because she's the mother of harlots. So the waters are flowing, and God's people are in jeopardy. But then the unity of Babylon is destroyed when the kings of the earth turn on her. You see, at the end of the chapter, in verse 16, it says that the kings that she fornicated with will hate the harlot, and they will make her desolate and naked, and they will burn her with fire, and they shall eat her flesh. That's another way of saying that they're going to be really mad at her for deceiving them. But of course, they can't blame the harlot. They had their Bibles. They could have read the Bible and made a choice, but they chose to follow the harlot. So chapter 17 begins by telling us that everything is hunky-dory for this threefold alliance. At the end, the alliance falls apart. The alliance is divided into three parts. And then the next section, Revelation 18, verses 6 through 24, this chapter describes the lamentation of the multitudes of the world when they see that Babylon falls. In other words, when the harlot is hated, now the wicked, they see that they have lost out on eternal life, and that the riches cannot save them. That is the context of Revelation 18, verses 6 to 24. God will utter his voice, and deliver his people shortly before the second coming of Jesus with the armies of heaven. Those are the kings that come from the east under the sixth plague. During this period, the merchants and the kings of the earth will lament and wail over the fact that the riches cannot save them in the day of God's wrath. And then in Revelation chapter 19, 1 through 10, when Babylon falls, what do you have? You have a song of joy in heaven, because God has judged the harlot and avenged God's people. So after Babylon falls, then you have this heavenly scene where all of heaven is singing because God has judged the harlot and the harlot has fallen. And of course, this song, which is in Revelation 19, 1 and 2, is in strong contrast. The joy of those that are singing in heaven is in strong contrast with those who are wailing in chapter 18. Notice Jeremiah 51, verses 48 and 49. When the heavens and earth and all that is in them shall sing joyously over Babylon, for the plunderers shall come to her from the north. The north is heaven, by the way, says the Lord. As Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall, so at Babylon the slain of all the earth shall fall. Are you seeing the connection there? What Babylon did to God's people, Babylon will suffer herself. And then, immediately after this song of the heavenly beings, singing because Babylon has fallen, then in Revelation 19, verses 11 to 21, you have a scene where a rider on a white horse, who is that rider on a white horse? Jesus, is coming to the earth. The armies of heaven are following him. And what event is that? It's the second coming of Christ, to come and rescue his people. And to do what else? Not only to rescue his people, but also to trample what? The winepress. We studied that in our first study here last evening. To trample the winepress. Who is in the winepress? Babylon is in the winepress. The harlot and her followers. That's Great Controversy, page 641. Now, we have a little bit more time, so let's take a look at the flow of chapter 18. In other words, the sequence of events in Revelation chapter 18. Revelation 17 and verse 18, which is the last verse of the chapter, links chapter 17 with chapter 18. Notice what it says. And the woman whom you saw, that is the harlot of Revelation 17, is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So the harlot is interchangeable with the city. So let's see what's going to happen with the city. By the way, the harlot would emphasize the religious aspect of Babylon. A city is a civil organization. It represents the civil fall of Babylon, or the political systems of the world, if you please. So let's notice the sequence. Revelation 18, 1 through 5. You have the call to come out of Babylon before Babylon is punished. Now, we're going to study this in more detail, but Revelation 18, 1 through 5 is really something that happens before the close of probation. It's the final warning before the close of probation. It takes us back, in other words, and warns people. After speaking about Babylon and her fall, God says, now let me give a final warning. That's Revelation 18, 1 through 5. And then he comes back to speak again about the fall of Babylon in the rest of chapter 18. So in chapter 18, 1 through 5, you have the call to come out of Babylon before Babylon is punished. This is during probationary time. In Revelation 18, 6 through 8, you have an emphasis of retribution upon Babylon for her sins. Verses 9 and 10, you have the lament of the kings of the earth. In Revelation 18, 11 to 16, you have the lament of the capitalists. Those are called the great men of the earth, those who actually control the capital of the world. Revelation 18, 17 through 19 is the lament of the employees and the travelers, the employees of the great men of the earth. Revelation 18 and verse 20, as we mentioned, has the rejoicing in heaven over Babylon's fall. In Revelation 18, 21 to 24, you have the drowning of the great city and the cessation of all of her activities. That is the sequence of Revelation chapter 18. Now, let's notice the next section. This is very important because we're going to deal with Revelation 18, 1 to 5. I mentioned in our study last night that Revelation is not written in chronological order. You have flashbacks. You know, in other words, the story takes you to a certain point, and then it takes you back to something that happened before that sequence started. And this is the case here. Revelation 18, 1 through 5 is a bridge between Revelation 17 and Revelation 18, 6 to 24. In other words, Revelation 17 portrays the final global apostasy of Babylon and her doom. And so does Revelation 18, verses 6 and following. But chapter 17 emphasizes the religious fall of Babylon. That's why harlot is used. In Revelation chapter 18, the emphasis is upon the political system and the economic system of Babylon, the political side. In between these two passages that describe the fall of Babylon, in other words, the fall of the religious aspect of Babylon and the civil aspect of Babylon, in between these two descriptions of the fall of Babylon, you have Revelation chapter 18 and verses 1 through 5. And what does Revelation 18, 1 through 5 say? It says, listen, because Babylon is going to fall, which is described in chapter 17, chapter 18, verses 6 to 24, what does God tell people to do before that happens? It says, flashback, he says, you better get out. Because if you don't get out, you're going to suffer the doom of Babylon. So 18, 1 through 5 is the final warning to get out of Babylon before Babylon falls, which is described in Revelation 17 and Revelation 18, verses 6 through 24. So summarizing here the bullet points, Revelation 17 describes the sins and doom that will fall upon Babylon. Chapter 18, 1 through 5 calls God's people to come out before the doom falls on Babylon. And Revelation 18, 6 through 24 gives us the lamentation of those who fail to respond to the call. Are you following me? See, these issues are complex. The book of Revelation is not like reading Time magazine. You know, it has a structure. And as Adventists, many times what we focus on, you know, we take a certain passage and we study that passage isolated from everything else. Or we'll interpret individual symbols. But when you study the structure, as we're doing, which is complex, you know, you say no human mind could have ever devised this. It's too intricate. It's too perfect. It just fits together like hand in glove. Now let's read the passage itself. This is the passage to call people out of Babylon. Before Babylon's doom. We call it the loud cry. It says there, after these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. And I mean really fallen. And has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated birds. Does it sound like a place you'd want to be? Definitely not. Now, why did she reach this point? Why did Babylon become demon-possessed? For all the nations have what? Drunk the wine. What is the wine? Welch's grape juice? No. The wine is fermented wine. And what does the wine do? It makes the multitudes what? Drunk. They can't grasp truth. How many of you have ever tried to give a Bible study to a drunk? It's worthless. Because their mind is under the influence. They can't grasp truth. And that's true also of people who are spiritual alcoholics, who drink the wine of Babylon. You know, you talk to them about the Sabbath, and they say, well, it was for the Jews. Nobody can judge me about Sabbath days, the Apostle Paul said. There's no way it can get in, because they're spiritually drunk. And that's the reason why Babylon becomes demon-possessed. Because it says, for, that means because all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. Notice, this is a system that is totally united. The harlot is united with the kings and with the daughters, with the merchants of the earth. Everything is going well. Now notice what it continues saying in verse 4. Because Babylon is demon-possessed at the end of time, another voice is heard from heaven. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, by the way, the loud cry angel that utters the loud cry is not the same angel that we find in verse 4. The loud cry angel represents us. The angel that gives his voice calling God's people out is God himself. You say, how do we know that? Because it says, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. So who's uttering these words? God himself. Come out of her, my people. Now, why are people supposed to come out? Is this taking place before the close of probation? You think this is taking place before the close of probation? Well, how do you know that? What good would it be to tell people to get out of Babylon if Babylon has already fallen? So it says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her what? In her sins, and lest you receive her plagues. Is this warning given before the plagues? It's given before the plagues. It's during probationary time. It's sandwiched, this passage is sandwiched between the fall of Babylon in chapter 17, the harlot, the kings hate the harlot, the multitudes turn against the harlot, and Revelation chapter 18, the kings of the earth and the merchants of the earth wail and bemoan because the financial system and the political system of Babylon has fallen. And in between, God says, listen, so you don't lament when Babylon falls, get out. Is that an urgent message? Well, it certainly is. So it says in verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive her plagues. For, that means because, her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. We're going to find that when it says that God has remembered her iniquities, it doesn't mean that God forgets. It means that God gives every nation, every city, and every individual a period of probation. And when their probation ends, the Bible describes it as God remembering, because now judgment is going to fall. We'll come to that a little bit later. Now let's go to the last section that we have time for on page 17, at the top of the page. There's a close link between the second angel's message in Revelation 14:8. Did the second angel's message say Babylon is fallen, and she has given her wine? Yes, the second angel's message says, and also the loud cry says it. So is there a connection between the two? Absolutely. So there's a close link between the second angel's message in Revelation 14:8 and the message of the loud cry angel in Revelation 18:1 through 5. The Millerites proclaimed the message of Revelation 14 verse 8. leading up to 1844. God's faithful left the fallen Protestant churches and joined those who were proclaiming the judgment hour message. The second angel's message will be proclaimed once more, just before the close of probation. However, the message will be global in extension and will have far greater power than during the period of the Millerites. Ellen White explained the relationship between Revelation 14:8 and chapter 18, 1-3 in a very clear way. Review and Herald, December 6, 1892. When Jesus began his public ministry, he cleansed the temple from its sacrilegious profanation. Among the last acts of his ministry was the second cleansing of the temple. So, in the last work for the warning of the world, two distinct calls are made to the churches. The second angel's message is Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And in the loud cry of the third angel's message, a voice is heard from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partaker of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities." So are you catching the picture? Leading up to 1844, and in the year 1844, the Millerites called people to come out of the fallen churches, out of Babylon. But Ellen White says that the moral fall of the churches was not complete at that moment of time. But at the end of time, the Bible tells us that Babylon will be totally demon-possessed. And at that time, the second angel's message will be repeated. By the way, do you think the first angel's message is also going to be repeated? Of course, you can't have a second angel's message without preaching the first. Why are you going to tell people to get out of Babylon? Well, because they didn't accept the first angel's message. They teach that the law was nailed to the cross, that the Sabbath was for the Jews, that you're judged the moment you die with heaven or hell. And so, basically, during this period of the loud cry, God's people will call God's faithful followers in those churches who did not understand the first angel's message. They'll accept the first angel's message. They'll come out of Babylon, which is the second angel's message, and in that way, they will not suffer the punishment of the beast and the image of the beast and those who receive the mark of the beast. One more quotation, Great Controversy 603 and 604. This scripture, Ellen White's describing Revelation 18, 1-5, this scripture points forward to a time when the announcement of the fall of Babylon, as made by the second angel of Revelation 14, is to be repeated, with the additional mention of the corruptions that have been entering the various organizations that constitute Babylon since that message was first given in the summer of 1844. Let me ask you, have many heresies entered the Christian world since 1844? Gay marriage, gay clergy, spiritual formation, among many others. She says a terrible condition of the religious world is here described. With every rejection of truth, the minds of the people will become darker, their hearts more stubborn, until they are entrenched in an infidel hardihood. In defiance of the warnings that God has given, they will continue to trample upon one of the precepts of the Decalogue until they are led to persecute those who hold it sacred. Christ is set at naught in the contempt placed upon his word and his people. As the churches accept, notice this, the teachings of spiritualism, and there's a refined kind of spiritualism today, entering even the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As the churches accept the teachings of spiritualism, the restraint imposed upon the carnal heart is removed. And the profession of religion, this is what Jay was talking about, and the profession of religion will become a cloak to conceal the basest iniquity. The Bible calls it the form of godliness without the power of godliness. She continues, a belief in spiritual manifestations opens the door to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, and thus the influence of evil angels will be felt in the churches. Quite a description, isn't it, of what the religious world is going to be like. and why the urgent call must be given for people to get out of there before the judgment falls on the harlot and on the city. And the harlot, of course, represents the papacy. She has daughters. She fornicates with the kings. The same is true with the fall of Babylon. It adds the merchants of the earth. This global system of religion, this global political system, will implode. But before it implodes, God will use his remnant people to call those who are sincere of heart and truly love the Lord to come out, so that they don't participate in Babylon's sins and they do not receive Babylon.